Hello there, and welcome once again to the Intersex podcast. I'm Jo Roberts. Thank you for listening, and if you haven't done already, please subscribe. The title of this podcast today is What is Enculturation and Why Does It Matter? This is a huge topic. I've been meaning to talk about this for a while. Because of what a huge topic it is, it's almost a certainty that I will have to split this podcast into two. In the first podcast, I'm going to talk about what enculturation is. I'm going to give you my own personal explanation of what it is, and then I'm going to give you some other definitions of it that I've found on the internet, talk a bit about various different examples of it, and then probably in the second podcast I will talk a bit about why it matters, particularly relating to the usual subject matter that I talk about in this podcast. So my own personal definition of enculturation is that it is basically attunement to widespread norms or norms which exist within your own tribe, usually family. Enculturation can be conscious or unconscious, but is usually unconscious. I like to say that enculturation exists on both a macro and micro level, so a person attunes to both cultural norms and family norms. Children are sort of savants of enculturation. They very much unconsciously attune to widespread norms, and they have a sort of radar for picking up widespread norms, but also the more familial norms which exist within their family unit, and they attune effortlessly to both, mainly because it's done unconsciously. Children are in the unconscious brainwave state for the first 8 years of their life. Now I'm going to give you another definition, and this one is taken from Wikipedia, and the reason that I'm giving this one is because I think it raises some quite interesting points which I think are quite relevant to this podcast. So I'm going to briefly run through the Wikipedia definition of what enculturation is. It says, enculturation is the process by which people learn the dynamics of their surrounding culture and acquire values and norms appropriate or necessary to that culture and its worldviews. As part of this process, the influences that limit, direct or shape the individual, whether deliberately or not, include parents, other adults and peers. If successful, enculturation results in competence in the language, values and rituals of the culture. I would add at this point, on a personal level, that media and the establishment and the education system also play a crucial role in this. It goes on to say, growing up, everyone goes through their own version of enculturation. It's very much an individual process. Enculturation helps form an individual into an acceptable citizen. Remember that term. This is very much relevant to what I normally talk about on this channel. Culture impacts everything that an individual does, regardless of whether they know about it. Enculturation is a deep-rooted process that binds together individuals. Even as a culture undergoes changes, elements such as centre convictions, values, perspectives and youngster raising practices remain similar. Enculturation paves way for tolerance, which is highly needed for peaceful cohabitance. It goes on to say, the process of enculturation, most commonly discussed in the field of anthropology, is closely related to socialisation, a concept central to the field of sociology. Both roughly describe the adaptation of an individual into social groups by absorbing the ideas, beliefs and practices surrounding them. In some disciplines, socialisation refers to the deliberate shaping of the individual. As such, the term may cover both deliberate and informal enculturation. The process of learning and absorbing culture need not be social, direct or conscious. I would add at this point it usually isn't conscious. There are examples of conscious enculturation, but mostly it's done unconsciously. Cultural transmission can occur in various forms. Through the most common though the most common social methods include observing other individuals, being taught or being instructed. Less obvious mechanisms include learning one's own culture from the media, the information environment, various social technologies, that's huge nowadays, which can lead to cultural transmission and adaptation across societies. A good example of this is a diffusion of hip-hop culture into states and communities beyond its American origins. Enculturation has often been studied in the context of non-immigrant African Americans. There's a quote here from Conrad Philip Kotak in a book called Window on Humanity, and he says, "Enculturation is the process where the culture that's currently established teaches an individual the accepted norms and values of the culture or society where the individual lives. The individual can become an accepted member and fulfill the needed functions and roles of the group. Most importantly, the individual knows and establishes a context of boundaries and accepted behaviour that dictates what is acceptable and not acceptable within the framework of that society. It teaches the individual their role within society as well as what is accepted behaviour within that society and lifestyle." So that pretty much covers the Wikipedia definition, so I'll just briefly summarise. Enculturation, whether conscious or unconscious, is about attunement to the prevalent social norms, whether on a macro or micro level, the purpose of which is to make oneself and others acceptable citizens, and, on a personal level, a person's own enculturation is designed to enhance their survival. Now I'm going to go on to talk a little bit about the conscious and unconscious versions of it. There are a few conscious examples of enculturation. An example would be people within a family consciously choosing to pass on cultural knowledge. Instructions to do certain things from teachers or parents are examples of conscious enculturation. Education, religious teachings, that sort of thing. Most enculturation is unconscious, so there's pretty much infinite examples of this. Much of enculturation occurs unconsciously through interaction, observation. Children naturally absorb information from their surroundings, and they also attune unconsciously to widespread cultural norms. It continues to fascinate and amaze me just how good children are at this process, much more so than adults. They effortlessly attune to widespread cultural norms and also much smaller familial norms. They unconsciously internalise those cultural norms and use them to sort of adapt their behaviour and their social expectations. This all happens without instruction where children are concerned. This is an amazing process, and it's also one of the key factors in terms of shaping the society in which we live. In terms of influences on human behaviour, and one of the sort of driving, most primal forces which sort of affects human behaviour, this would be probably in the top 3 enculturation. The children are particularly receptive to absorbing cultural information, often without questioning it and often without fully understanding the significance of what it is that they're learning. Many aspects of enculturation remain deeply ingrained, and they continue to operate throughout the lifespan on an unconscious level. I'm now going to talk a little bit about the negative aspects of enculturation, although I will cover more of this in the next podcast, which will be why enculturation matters. But briefly, I'll summarise some of the negative aspects of enculturation. Through enculturation, a person can acquire beliefs which don't necessarily represent reality from either parents or society. They can acquire beliefs which don't necessarily benefit them or others. Widespread cultural practices can sometimes elevate one group at the expense of another, for example ethnocentrism. Resistance to change, hindering progress and limiting openness to new ideas. An emphasis on conformity to the detriment of individuality, creativity and personal growth. It can perpetuate cultural stereotypes, can create conflicts between different groups, for example young and old, can cause problems as regards cultural relativism, i.e. not examining one's own culture and beliefs even if they're harmful. There's pressure to conform to specific roles limiting choice and leading to feelings of obligation or expectation, once again stifling authenticity and individuality. It can be used as a tool of cultural suppression, eroding identities and traditions, and in some instances, obviously, it can foster things like xenophobia or racism, but that's really the tip of the iceberg. In terms of negative expressions of this very strong force, I will cover more of those in the second part of this podcast, and thank you very much for listening.